The village of Oregon was dying. For 30 years, no rain had touched the land. The sun burned like fire, and the earth cracked like the dry skin of an old man. Rivers had turned to dust. Trees stood like skeletons. The people were starving. But inside the great palace, there was no hunger. King Ezenwa, the ruler of Oregon, sat on his golden throne, his belly round like a full moon. His palace was filled with food, bags of grain, fat cows, roasted meat, sweet fruits, while outside, his people ate leaves and chewed on stones. Every morning, the king's guards went into the village and took whatever little food the people had left. They stole yams from old women. They took dried fish from crying children. They kicked down doors and emptied cooking pots. Nobody dared to fight back. Nobody, except one man. His name was Dyke. He was the poorest farmer in Oregon. His hut was so empty that even rats refused to live there. His clothes were torn, his ribs stuck out, and he had nothing except a secret. A secret that could destroy the king. Why do we allow some people to grow rich while others suffer? Is it because of fear? Or do we believe they deserve it? That night, Dyke sat alone in his small hut, staring at the dusty floor. Once, this place was filled with laughter, his wife's soft voice, his children's playful giggles. But now, it was silent. His family was gone, dead, starved. Dyke closed his eyes. His body was weak, his stomach empty, but his heart burned with anger. Then, suddenly, a cold wind blew through the hut, and a voice whispered in his ear, a voice that did not belong to the living. Dyke, the king is not above death. He too can hunger. He too can beg. Dyke's eyes flew open. He looked around. Nobody was there. But the shadows moved. The wind howled like spirits. The ancestors had spoken. Dyke knew what he had to do. Many African cultures believe ancestors can guide the living. But was this truly a spirit speaking to Dyke? Or was it his own pain and anger creating a voice inside his head? The next morning, Dyke walked to the king's palace. His legs were weak, his body shook, but in his hand, he held a small leather pouch. When the palace guard saw him, they laughed. "What can a starving man offer the king?" one mocked. But when they opened the pouch, their laughter stopped. Inside were golden seeds, shining like the morning sun. The head guard frowned. "What? What is this?" Dyke smiled. "A gift," he said. "A seed that grows into the rarest fruit in the world. A fruit so sweet that even the gods cry when they taste it. A fruit that brings endless wealth to whoever eats it first." The guards dragged him to the throne room. King Ezenwa leaned forward, his greedy eyes blazing. "Impossible," he whispered. "Test it," Dyke said, "but be warned. Once planted, it must be watered with the blood of a pure-hearted soul. Only then will it grow." The king hesitated. His fingers tightened around his golden staff. Then he did what all greedy men do when faced with temptation. He agreed. If something sounds too good to be true, why do people still believe it? Is it greed, hope, or is it simply human nature? The golden seeds were planted in the palace courtyard. For 3 nights, the king ordered his most loyal servants to cut their hands and bleed onto the soil, but nothing grew. "Fools!" the king roared. "Perhaps your hearts are not pure enough." So, he made a terrible decision. He ordered the sacrifice of his own family, his wives, his children. One by one, their blood watered the earth. And on the 7th night, something grew, a tree black as night, with sharp thorns twisting toward the sky, and hanging from its center, a single golden fruit. The king lunged forward. He grabbed it. He bit into it. And at that moment, the hunger began. The king had everything. yet he still wanted more. But when we chase something blindly, we sometimes run straight into our own destruction. The palace shook. The sky split open, revealing a giant mouth. No eyes, no nose, only teeth. The king screamed. His stomach twisted. It growled like a hungry beast. He ate meat. He ate bread. He ate fruit. But he was still hungry. So he ate his servants, his advisors, his soldiers, until finally, only Dyke remained. The poor farmer smiled. "You took everything from us," he whispered. "Now let's see how much you can take from yourself." The king's hands shook. His mouth foamed. Then, like a wild animal, he turned on himself. And in the morning, the palace was empty. The throne dripped with blood. And Dyke, the poor farmer, walked away as the new ruler of Oregon. If you could have unlimited power, but at a terrible cost, would you take it? Or would you walk away? Dyke sat on the blood-stained throne. The golden fruit still hung from the cursed tree. It glowed. It whispered, "You are king now, Dyke. But how long before your hunger begins?" His stomach rumbled. The cycle had only just begun. Dyke sat alone in the empty palace. The golden fruit still hung from the cursed tree, glowing like a piece of the sun. The whispers grew louder. "Eat. Taste. You are king now, but for how long?" Dyke clenched his fists. He had won. The greedy king was gone. The people of Oregon would never starve again. But why did his stomach feel so empty? Why did his hands tremble when he reached for the fruit? He ripped it from the branch, brought it to his lips, took a bite. The juices burned his tongue like fire. And then the hunger began. Why is it that the things we crave the most often bring the greatest suffering? Is power ever truly satisfying, or does it only create a new hunger? Dyke's stomach twisted. At first, it was a simple craving. A little bread, a little wine. Then he wanted more than his hands could hold, more than his mouth could chew. Within days, the palace granaries were empty. Within weeks, the livestock were gone. The people of Oregon, once hopeful under their new ruler, began to whisper, "He is just like the old king." No, he is worse. Dyke sat on the throne, panting like a wild beast. His belly was round, swollen, yet he was still starving. He looked at the people before him, their thin arms, their tired faces. His hunger whispered, "Flesh. Blood." He shut his eyes. No, he would not become like King Ezenwa. He had to find a way to stop the hunger. Does power truly change a man, or does it only reveal who he always was? Desperate, Dyke left the palace and journeyed into the dark forest, where an ancient witch was said to live. They called her Mama Eek, the one who saw the past, the present, and the future. When Dyke arrived, she was waiting. Her eyes were milky white, her skin as wrinkled as old leather. "You have eaten the cursed fruit," she croaked. "Now it eats you." "How do I stop it?" Dyke begged. Mama Eek smiled, revealing teeth too sharp for a human mouth. "You cannot." Dyke's heart pounded. There must be a way. The witch tilted her head. "Only one, but it is worse than the hunger." Dyke swallowed hard. "Tell me." The witch leaned close. "You must feed the tree with the blood of your own flesh and blood." Dyke froze. "My own flesh?" "Yes," she whispered, "or the hunger will never end." How often do we seek solutions, only to find that the price of fixing a mistake is worse than living with it? Dyke returned to the palace, his mind racing. He had no wife, no children. But there was someone. His mother. She was old, weak. Would it not be mercy to let her go? No, 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 no. He gritted his teeth. Would he become the monster he once defeated? Would he spill blood just to survive? His hands shook, his stomach twisted. And then he heard her voice. "My son?" Dyke turned. His mother stood in the doorway, her face full of love. "Are you unwell, my child?" she asked, stepping forward. Dyke clenched his fists. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He had to decide. Would he do the unthinkable, or would he let the hunger consume him? What is the true test of character? Is it power? Is it wealth? Or is it what a man does when he must choose between himself and those he loves? Just as Dyke opened his mouth to speak, a spear flew past his face. It buried itself in his mother's chest. She gasped. Dyke's eyes widened in horror. Behind her stood his most trusted guard, Obinna. "What have you done?" Dyke roared. Obinna's face was blank. "Saving Orogun!" Dyke screamed. He ran to his mother, caught her before she fell. Her breath was weak. "My son," she whispered, "you are still good." And then she was gone. Dyke's fingers dug into the dirt. The earth drank her blood. The cursed tree shook. And then a new fruit appeared. Brighter, bigger, more golden than the last. Obinna stared, and before Dyke could react, Obinna took the fruit and ate it. How often do men justify evil in the name of righteousness? And when we destroy monsters, are we not sometimes creating new ones? At first, nothing happened. Then, Obinna fell to his knees, screaming. His stomach ripped open. From inside his body, black, twisted roots burst out. His arms snapped, his skin turned to bark, and before Dyke's horrified eyes, Obinna became the new tree. The golden fruit grew from his skull. His mouth remained open, frozen in an eternal scream. Dyke staggered back. The hunger in his stomach vanished. The curse had moved on. He was free. Or was he? Because as he looked at the villagers staring in shock, he saw their eyes shift. They were hungry now. Their lips trembled. And one by one, they turned to the new tree. They reached for the golden fruit. And Dyke knew the cycle was about to begin again. Can a curse ever be broken? Or does it simply find new victims? Is history doomed to repeat itself because men never learn? Dyke fled, ran through the forest, past the witch's hut, past the rivers and mountains, until he found himself at the edge of the world. And there, waiting for him, stood a man in golden robes. His face was hidden. His voice was smooth as silk. "Did you really think you won, Dyke?" The man chuckled. Dyke's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward. And when the moonlight hit his face, it was King Isenwa, the old king, the one Dyke had defeated. But you?" Dyke couldn't breathe. King Isenwa smiled, his teeth sharper than before. "You never killed me," he whispered. "I was just waiting." And as Dyke's screams filled the night, the story began again. If evil never truly dies, does that mean it is not meant to be destroyed, but understood?